Political Desk.
Yes, it is that time of the week, as we always do at the start of a week. We just run root over some of the big stories that are doing the rounds or that are the focus of our attention in this the ever busy political news cycle. Joining us, our commentator this morning, Musa Mdunge. Good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Thabiso, and good morning to the listeners.
Well, the starting with the NEC here, and their Secretary General has been doing something of a firefighting effort here and trying to ward off perceptions of the NEC as a corrupt organization, especially based on the information that's been heard at both the Mdunge Commission of Inquiry and Parliament's ad hoc committee.
Yeah. Well, look, he may attempt to do that with all the rhetoric that he may muster, but, the evidence will be in action, and it is very clear. When you hear from your mayoral candidate who then says, 2 years out of the local government elections, listen, fellow Joburgers, don't expect much from me. That is quite worrying because it presents opposite messages to the electorate. Mm-hmm. And that's the challenge for Fikile Mbalula, is that it's not so much what he says at the podium, it is the action that his party takes both in the government of national unity and in all other governments that they're in, both from a provincial and local government level. That is what's going to convince South Africans that the ANC can be a trusted party. But if you look at international evidence, ruling parties that have been voted out don't recover electorally. That is just a fact. The challenge for the ANC is how best can they stop the bleeding, and the best way is really to change in terms of policy implementation.
I wonder what you have made of this ad hoc committee, because, of course, that is a very political process that's underway. The rules, governing the way in which things are conducted in that committee, ad hoc committee, are very different from those perhaps that we would see at the commission, and in terms of what would be permissible in terms of questions. What have you made of the line of questioning that you've heard from members of parliament to those that have appeared before it thus far, being General Mkhwanazi and General Masemola?
I must say there has really been a poverty from my end of the way in which members of parliament ought to conduct themselves in what, yes, may be a political process here, Thabiso, but is still very much a very legal process. I would imagine that one of the most foundationary of subject matters that members of parliament or the political class ought to have is a knowledge and a basic knowledge of the South African law, Thabiso. And you see from the level of questioning here that is simply been lacking. Yes, it has been strong on the political end, but when you juxtapose it to the Mdunge Commission, it's missing on the legal end.
That and that was so clearly in evidence more, I think, on the one member who was, questioning General Masemola and kept insisting that General Masemola should have known about a report that was sent to IPID, or should know the status of an IPID report, seemingly not knowing that IPID does not report to the police commissioner.
You see, and there is where it lies, because it is that kind of line of questioning that then exposes the lack, the lacunae in the legal knowledge of members of parliament. And that is quite worrying for me. And in many ways, it is a moment, though, I think that we do need as South Africans who are going to go to the voting booth next year and make certain decisions. And so this moment allows South Africans an opportunity to see which party best is able to represent them in all facets.
What do you make, just also in terms of the evidence that has been presented, which has really, put the minister in particular in a very compromised position, that, whatever comes out of this, especially the fact that you are dealing with a very political process, and as far as the ad hoc committee is concerned, that if the numbers stack up in his favor, General Mkhunu, despite all these question marks that have been raised about him, or not General Mkhunu, but Minister Mkhunu, may well continue in his position.
Well, certainly, right? Because at the end of the day, this still remains a political process. And so if the numbers back him up, then he will win the day. And that therefore raises questions here, Thabiso, especially for parties like the Democratic Alliance. Where will they move? Where will they vote? Will they support their political partner in government in a very critical process, or will they leave the ANC to out for dry? And it will all depend on where the money is stacked. But in many ways, for the ANC, arcing back to that first question, it's not just about the rhetoric here. Will the president take a definitive action against his own minister, a minister who was very critical in his elevation to becoming both ANC president and the president of the republic? That is still the question of the hour.
Absolutely. I mean, the question marks, and I don't know whether you have yourself come to any sort of conclusion as far as that's concerned in terms of whether the president is likely to be or should be hauled before the commission of at least the ad hoc committee, certainly, and I don't know so much as well, perhaps even to the commission of inquiry itself.
I think he should be, because, for the kind of power that the President of the Republic of South Africa holds legally, he's a man who doesn't face much questioning if you think about it, Thabiso. I find even the American president is held at a higher level of accountability than the South African president. And yet, when you look from a power to power, especially from a legal end, these men almost hold the same level of power. At the end of the day, it is the president as the head of state and head of government who is also the head of the South African security. And so he's got questions that he's got to answer here that he cannot run away from in order to ensure that full accountability is maintained, which is important for the maintenance of democracy in South Africa. And I think it's key as the head of state that being part of his duty, he has to come before either the ad hoc committee or the Mdunge committee.
My guest this morning and on a political desk, our commentator is political analyst Musa Mdunge. Let me take a quick call from you, Thabo, in Mamelodi. Go ahead and just keep it nice and brief for me.
Yes, morning, Titi, your guest there. Titi, as your guest has said, Titi, I'm very much worried about the powers that have been given to the president. Because if you can look at the timelines of our presidents who have been firing and hiring of the national commissioners, it's very well troublesome to have this kind of powers as a president, because of in some instance, these powers are being abused. That's my thing.
Okay, Musa Mdunge, do you want to comment on that as we wrap up?
He raises a very good point here, right? I mean, you would imagine with the kind of history that South Africa has, arcing back to the apartheid years, that a post-1994 political and constitutional frameworking would ensure that power is not mastered in the hands of one person. But in many ways, while South Africa has turned away from Parliament being the dominant sort of institution as is under apartheid, it has vested more powers in the president. And I think we've got to question that because, for example, let's say in a time where the president is out of the country, the deputy president is out of the country, the kind of power mastered by an acting president, for example, I think a lot needs to be clarified in terms of that. You will remember back in the 90s, when then acting President Buthelezi, invaded Lesotho, right? As acting president, right? There were a lot of questions around that matter. So what happens in a time like this? Or, for example, when the country goes through a coup d'etat, for example, right? There are many things that we need to clarify. And I think it is time that both Parliament and other institutions of our democracy really act and get those answers for us.
Musa Mdunge is a political commentator this morning on the political desk. Thank you so much for coming through. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Here you go.